Hello and welcome to Insights with me, Lynne O'Donnell. I'm joined by Lauryn Oates, a Canadian academic and activist who's been working on issues regarding the status and rights of women in Afghanistan for many years. She has a particular interest in education, and I've talked to her in the past about the impact of school bans on the girls of Afghanistan and of a Taliban-controlled education for boys. She's scathing in her very measured and learned way about the global silence that permits the abuses to prevail and which should be a lesson for us all. Have a listen. All right. Well, thanks for your time, Lauryn. I really appreciate it. You've been involved with women's rights issues in Afghanistan for a long time. Canadian Women for Afghan Women is undergoing some changes, including its name, which will become Right to Learn Afghanistan. Can you explain why these changes, why now, and what difference it's going to make?
Yeah, so we're an organization that's just over a quarter of a century old. So things change in that time. And of course, our operational environment being Afghanistan, lots changes all the
Mm.
time, and especially in the last 3 years. And while nothing in our mission is changing, we do education work. Our work is all about the empowerment of women and really opening up more options for women to gain agency and gain dignity. And we wanted a name that conveys that work more, that says something about the how, what we actually do, which is using the pathway of education to make rights more achievable for women. So it's been in discussion for a long time, but it seemed now is the right time to do this. And with a lot of planning, it's actually happening in just a few days from now. So we're getting ready for that shift and going to a shorter name.
Yeah, well, that focus on education in Afghanistan must be heartbreaking and frustrating these days. What's your assessment of the situation 3 years after the collapse of the Republic and the return of the Taliban to power?
It is dismal for sure, and it's feels very stuck at the moment. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But we have been in the business of taking the long view, and I think in the long run, the situation is just not tenable. It'll collapse on itself. And it's just a matter of when. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 20 years. And I think in the meantime, what we have to be prepared to do is everything in our power to restore rights for women and girls through alternative means. And what we've really seen in the last 3 years is states not stepping up. We simply can't rely on governments to do what's right here and to intervene when this is really their mess. So we just have to roll up our sleeves and do everything we can. And for us, what that means is finding alternative ways for women and girls to access education, and not the only way, but by all means the really most important way, the most viable way right now is online, is using technology. So that's a big part of what we do, and we work in cooperation with a wide range of actors who are also trying to do that, so that we're doing it in somewhat of a coordinated way. But it's an uphill battle, and I'm an optimist by nature. I've worked in Afghanistan my entire career, more than 20 years. I've seen a lot of ups and downs. I started doing this work when the Taliban were in power the first time round. So I'm not unaccustomed to there being, difficulties and lots of challenges in the work. But the last 3 years has it's been more of a struggle to stay optimistic. But it is there. There's hope there, and one of the ways I access hope is I get to talk to women and girls in Afghanistan. I get to engage with them directly, and I hear their stories of tragedy, but I also hear their stories of triumph. I hear about the times that they find a way to get back into a classroom, or to find safety, or to land a remote job, or just to have their hope restored in some way. These little wins. So that's kind of what keeps me going, and convinces me that there's a point to this, that we have to keep going, even when it feels really, really hopeless. And ultimately, things will turn around, and we can play a role in making that happen sooner.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just been saying, but let's just move forward for a little while. I mean, it's not just girls, it's also boys. And it's not just girls being locked out of proper education, it's girls going to Taliban madrasas just so that they can learn something, anything. What's the long term impact likely to be?
That is a issue that should concern absolutely everyone on the face of this planet. It should concern policymakers the world over. It should concern ordinary members of the public. It should concern scholars and just everyone in between. What's happening in the public education system as it still stands in Afghanistan. It is now, in the clutches of the Taliban, and they are reshaping it. And they have a lot of intention to what they're doing. This is not a haphazard thing that they're making up as they go along. They have a plan, and they've been pretty transparent about that plan. There's a document, you can find it in its entirety online in Dari, but it's publicly available, in which they outlined their plans for the education system. And they did that before they even had power. This is several years old now. And it's about 75 pages long, and it tells how they plan to strip the education curriculum of everything to do with the sciences, anything that they think is associated with, the West, very generally speaking. So things like the invention of electricity shouldn't be mentioned in the curriculum. They want no mention of women's rights. They want no images of women and girls. They want no mention of democracy, the United Nations. They want to bring in their ideology that really goes against pluralism in the country. So nothing that celebrates anything that is not their own version of Islam. So mention of things like the Bamiyan Buddhas that they destroyed, or the existence of other religious sects and cultures in the country are all going out of the curriculum. So that's sort of one side of it. And then the other is converting public schools to madrasas. And that's happened at a large scale for boys already. And it's now happening for girls as well. So this year, the Taliban announced that girls can go to school if it's a madrasa past grade 6. And the reality is that many will take them up on that because they just want to be in a school. And parents want some kind of education for their kids. So they'll send them to what is there. And this happening at scale over a sufficient period of time will have consequences for security within Afghanistan, and eventually within the region, and eventually beyond it. And we've sort of seen this movie before. We saw what happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the Taliban harbored Osama bin Laden in Kandahar. And from there, he planned the 9/11 attacks. So it's really not a mystery, what the Taliban's plans are, what their ideology is, who they're sympathetic to, their alliances with other extremist groups. And now they have in their control an education system which they are mobilizing towards that end. And I think we should be really, really worried about that.
Well, it's the same people in charge, so why should it be any different? And they've learned a lot over the last of the 20 years that they were in the wilderness, so to speak. And they have made lies an art form, really, haven't they? There was a lot of belief in them being people that we can work with before they came back to power. But we're speaking in the aftermath of the latest assault on the position of women in society in Afghanistan. They're no longer allowed to make any noise in public, show any skin in public. Effectively, they're not allowed to be. I can only imagine what goes on inside their homes, that they're not allowed to leave now. And my view is that when the extremes of behaviour are normalised, everything in between is threatened. And yet there's been a deafening silence from not only governments outside, but apart from the major players like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty every now and then, very little from feminist groups. I guess in America, where women's rights and physical autonomy, reproductive autonomy is under assault, they've got other things to do. But what's happening in Afghanistan, I guess it could be argued, the normalisation of that extreme abuse makes it easier to roll back what seems to be, just stuff you take for granted.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think there's sort of two components here. There's the issue of what the Taliban do directly, the human rights abuses that they perpetrate themselves. The imprisonment of women activists who end up gang raped in prison, and this is extremely well documented that this is happening on a systemic level. The extrajudicial assassinations, the disappearances, the beatings in the street, the repression of protests, all of that they're directly responsible for. But there's this other component, the whole environment that they've created, which now enables any misogynist to freely act without consequence. So any man who wants to beat his wife, or his daughter or his mother or his sister can do so and not worry about the consequences. And we're seeing many examples of this. And actually, just a few weeks ago, Afghan Witness released a report with their results of documented femicide in the country, and it was in the neighborhood of 500 plus, and they said that's the tip of the iceberg. This is just what we know from public sources what's happening, but the problem is much bigger, and that's in a mere 3 years. So this problem is going to get worse as their control is entrenched, and it is something that everyone who calls himself a feminist should be worried about, no matter where you are in the world. And where I happen to live is literally the farthest point on the planet from Afghanistan. If you spin a globe, it's on the other side, and that matters not at all whatsoever. At the end of the day, these are women under assault, and that's the definition of a feminist. You're supposed to feel solidarity towards your fellow women wherever they are, whatever their religion is, whatever their skin color is. And I think what we're seeing happen in Western feminism or feminism in this part of the world is really concerning, because you see an insularity. There's a real preoccupation with issues that are happening locally, and those issues are important, but they're not the only things going on. And that solidarity part of the feminist identity seems to have disappeared over time. And I'm hearing Muslim women in Afghanistan and elsewhere say, where are our feminist allies? Like, where are the women in other countries standing up for us? This has really ended up their fight, and it shouldn't be their fight alone, because actually it implicates all of us. And what a lot of the advocacy groups from Afghanistan and Iran and other countries where women's rights are under assault are saying is, us first, and then you. And we know both the first time the Taliban were in power and this time that gave a lot of encouragement to other extremist groups that have misogyny as a core part of their ideology. Boko Haram and ISIS and other groups. They saw what the Taliban got away with, and they drew inspiration from that. And they noted that the international community essentially sat back and let it happen. So we'll see what happens from here. But yeah, it's something that I think about a lot, and I've sort of had to think about it in parallel to the work I do in Afghanistan. From the get go, this question of how we on the outside respond to what's going on in Afghanistan. And there's just a lot to say about that and our own culture.
Well, I remember when I first got to Afghanistan as a Kabul-based reporter, I was incredibly shocked by what I found. Even though I knew about it, I realised that women outside, especially women in the West, can't identify with. It just seems so impossible. It is impossible to imagine living in that extremely abusive way. We know about domestic violence in our own cultures, but women go out to work, we wear what we want, we pretty much do what we want. And imagining that extreme abuse is impossible for most women, and for most women who are making a living, looking after their kids, doing the do. And I think maybe that's a part of it. It's not explained to women, especially in the West, in what I would call normal societies, in a way that they can identify with, let alone understand. Maybe that's the problem. How do you translate it into something that can be understood and therefore, and from that point, acted upon?
I think that's definitely part of it. Is a certain segment of people, they're shutting it out because it's really heavy. It's not something people want to think about, and it's pretty easy to shut it out. It's happening far away. It's not in the news very much anymore. So they can essentially feel compassion for a moment, and then turn away and move on with their lives. But I think there's something else going on too, and I think it's how we've prioritized the social issues that we care about. And in my own society, in Canada, we're very concerned with not offending people and being culturally sensitive and culturally accepting. And I think we've sort of missed something here where we've upheld what we perceive to be the importance of not stepping on other cultures' toes versus calling a spade, and calling out a wrong when you see one. And it's a misunderstanding that that these so-called other cultures think we want that to happen, but often the women are saying, no, speak out, treat me as you would treat yourself. Like if the situation was reversed, we'd want it that way. If my rights were under assault, I would want women in Afghanistan and other countries to be coming to my defense and pointing out our commonalities rather than our differences. And I know that it comes from a good place. People think they're being progressive. They think that they're being respectful of other cultures and other ways of living. But they're actually subjecting Afghan women to a different set of standards. They're saying, you're not really ready to demand the same things that we expect as a matter of normalcy. The right to work, the right to education, the right to political participation. Those things are for us here in the West, where we're more advanced, not for you. And that is just totally infantilizing. And in its own way, it's racist. So you sort of, end up in this loop. And there's a French philosopher, Pascal Bruckner, who had a great term for this. He called it the racism of the anti-racists. So it's just kind of a breakdown of logic of the way people, why we're making these choices to react this way to these problems in the world. And I think that needs to be challenged, and we need to transform our own culture to include everybody in the values that we say we espouse. Those values have to be universal, or they're nothing. They simply don't work if
Yeah.
they're not universal.
Well, indeed. I mean, there's that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think that applies to some of what you were just saying. But then there's also that fallback on tradition. When the Taliban came back to power, Imran Khan, who was adored in cricket-playing countries, and people believe that he's a progressive, said, well, why should they send their girls to school? Because traditionally they don't send their girls to school anyway, which is patronising and racist and wrong, because it's the patriarchal system of power that falls back on tradition as an excuse for abuse. In my view, it's pretty easy to see it like that, but tradition and religion are trotted out as excuses for abuse and depriving people of what are universal rights, as you say, but are often painted as Western values, not human values.
That's just it. They're excuses. They're nothing more than excuses. And no culture in the world is static, including our own. I mean,
Exactly.
there was a time here in Canada where it was normal, that women left school early, or they didn't go to school at all, and they certainly didn't go to university. And even in my grandmother's time, if you got married, you had to leave your job. You couldn't
Oh,
teach or,
yeah.
or nurse or whatever. You had to leave your job.
Mm.
And so we are allowed to change, but it seems that others we treat them as frozen in time. And in Afghanistan itself, there's no evidence that it's ever been static, that there's ever been one tradition, that has been unchanged for millennia. I spent a lot of time researching the history of education for girls for a lecture I gave a couple of years ago, and I intended to sort of cover like the last 50 years, and I ended up going centuries back because there was just so much evidence that there have always been women and girls pursuing learning. It didn't look the same as it does now in a classroom. It might be private tutor centuries ago, but it's always been there. It's always been part of the history, and their culture has always been under transformation, just like everywhere else in the world. But we really do love exoticizing Afghans, and I think in part because it gives us that excuse where we can just say, well, this is not our problem because these are not our people, this is not our culture.
Mm.
We should mind our own business,
Mm.
and I think that's just so wrongheaded.
Yes, whereas if the abuse is going on next door, it is our business and it's our duty and responsibility to intervene, and that's just what's not happening. And I'm wondering how long. We know how difficult it was to make changes and introduce changes over the 20 years of the Republic when change was encouraged. How long does this go on, given that it is becoming even more profound and more ingrained and embedded the longer the Taliban are in power and pursuing this agenda? How long does it go on before it becomes irreversible or even more difficult to expunge, change, drag back into our century after this era ends?
Yeah, it's there's so many variables to consider in answering that question, and I mean one variable is the divide between the haves and haves not, and the those who can actually leave, because most people who have the ability to leave are attempting to do so, and several million have managed to do it, and others will follow them. So people are really voting with their feet, and so that's gonna remove a lot of the people who benefited from the openness of the last 20 years, those who accessed an education, who were professionals, who were the intelligentsia of the society. And we've sort of seen this happen before in previous eras of Afghanistan's conflicts. And there'll always be people who they just can't leave. They're too poor. They have no means to do so, and they'll be left behind. And I think they'll be the most vulnerable to the changes that are happening. And yeah, it's hard to pinpoint, what is the point of no return. But it's on the horizon, and I think a big problem is that we're not even recognizing the main dangers. I think we're looking in the wrong places. We're focused on the threat of ISIS and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, and those are threats. But we're not focused on what's happening in the education system and how much can be done through the curriculum and through radicalizing people that way at a really really mass scale. I don't think that's on the agenda at all in terms of security monitoring. So that makes it more likely that there'll be consequences from that. And already there's been so many transformations in the education system, and those will start trickling out into the broader society in not very long. I mean, people will have to be pragmatic, and they're stuck where they are, and they will do what they need to survive in that system. And yet there's such a legacy from the past 2 decades of all the change that occurred. And of course, I'll qualify that with all of the problems that are, well documented of the republic, the corruption, and the fact that they didn't reach all parts of the country. I mean, but a lot of that is to be expected in a country that's going through a democratic development. It's a process. It's not something that just flips from one day to another. So it had its problems, but it did create an environment where a lot of people were able to pursue the lives that they wanted to live freely. And many millions of people ended up in a totally different socioeconomic category than where they came from. And over again, I found myself standing in classrooms, and I'd always ask two questions to kids. What do you want to be when you grow up? And the other one is, are you the first person in your family to go to school? And in almost every classroom, a majority of kids were the first person, the first generation in their family to go to school. So the country was just on the cusp of this major social transformation, and that got interrupted. But there was an impact that we're now seeing, that's coming out in the way people are responding to the repressive policies, which is very, very different from the first time the Taliban were in power. The population was so much more isolated. They did not have a widespread means of communication. There wasn't, so many ties to the outside world. There wasn't it's been battered, but there's still an independent Afghan media sector left, and they're bravely reporting on what's going on. I mean, you can go on, yeah, you can go on X, you can go on social media, and you can hear what they have to say and what they're watching happen in the country. Um, so we can know what's going on in a way that we couldn't, in the 1990s. So there's all these differences, and they really do matter, and they're making it harder for the Taliban to get away with what they're trying to do. It's just not the same population, that they can pull the wool over their eyes as they did before. But the people are still getting a really, really tough go of it.
Yeah, but I think also, to expand on that, the Taliban, we said before, learnt a lot during the 20 years that they were in the cold. And now they have China behind them. China is selling firewalls, or whatever they're called, stops on internet access to next door Pakistan, is selling surveillance technology to the Taliban. And I think that the walls are closing in. They've got complete control of the domestic media, and access to outside media, I think, is also slowly closing down. And so that isolation is also a part of their agenda. Foreign reporters don't go in. Journalists who are still calling themselves journalists are not allowed to do journalism inside of Afghanistan. So that access to information that could slow the isolation of people's minds, if you like, is encroaching. And I'm wondering about the deprogramming that will have to happen all over again. It was a slow process. I mean, there was so much progress was made, but Afghanistan was regularly, annually, the worst place in the world to be born female throughout the 2 decades of the Republic. And the longer this goes on in a much more, it seems to me, systematic way, then isn't it going to be harder to come out of it?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm very worried about the normalization of engagement with the Taliban, which I think is a
Mm,
step towards recognition of them. And
mm,
you mentioned China; that's been underway for a while, both in terms of diplomatic engagement, but a lot of economic engagement too, and they go hand in hand. Pakistan, Russia. Just this month, we had, the UAE recognize, a diplomat, in from the Taliban administration, and Kazakhstan as well, and without consequence. And I think other states that are thinking about it are observing this and seeing there was no outcry. This is acceptable, and the the, the more dominoes will fall. And I just can't understand why that's happening, why anyone wants to ally with this group. But it is something that the Taliban learned from the first time round, that they want relationships with other states. You need that to be a part of the global community. So they're pursuing it this time, and and they learned themselves how to use technology. So while they will seek to repress it for, the broader citizenry, for themselves, they use it to disseminate their
mm.
ideology further, and it will not stay contained within Afghanistan.
No, history has shown that to be true indeed. This brings us to efforts, I think, to put some sort of a name to what is going on in Afghanistan right now. I'm thinking of the term gender apartheid. You and I have talked about this before. Can you explain the genesis of the term, what it means, and what its codification as a crime against humanity would mean, and what difference it would make? I mean, that's a lot of questions all in one go, but maybe start with, what is gender apartheid?
Yeah, gender apartheid is absolutely the right term to use to describe the situation because it refers to an entire system of discrimination that is embedded through laws and rules and behaviors, which is different from a random series of discriminatory policies or a rule here and there. It's the whole system, and it's really the heart of the system. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. They think that the Taliban's misogynist behaviors are something they do sort of on the side of what they're really pursuing, but
Mm.
it is absolutely central to their ideology, the hatred of women, and gender apartheid kind of gets at that. And It's not a new term. It was widely used in the 1990s by Afghan women activists who were exiled, who were advocates on this issue. And even before that, it was apparently used by Iranian women after the revolution to describe the situation in their country, which is also a whole series of discriminatory regulations and laws. And that's sort of one side of it. It's a accurate description of what's going on. The other reason that it's the right term to use is that it opens up possibilities around justice through the international system and perhaps some accountability, because gender persecution is already recognized as an international crime, but gender apartheid specifically is not. And so that's something that activists are pursuing, that this become codified, that gender apartheid is codified under international law in the same way that racial apartheid already is.
Hmm.
And they've sort of looked at the case of South Africa and how that was successfully used to pursue the end of apartheid through the international justice system. So it's both a great tool for advocacy, but also for international justice. And there's several mechanisms that can be pursued. Some sort of are existing mechanisms that we can use in the legal system. Others require reform or new laws to pass. But the movement knows what needs to be done, and they're going for this, and it can ultimately result in the Taliban being wanted, if they are prosecuted and found guilty. They can be tried in the International Criminal Court and through other forums. So it's a really really important piece of what we can do right now. So it's I think you can look at the work of Dr. Karima Banoun is a great resource to sort of see in greater detail, exactly what gender apartheid is and what the possibilities are internationally. But the good news, and we need good news these days, is that there's a lot of mobilization around this. There's a lot of momentum, and I think one by one, different states will start to rally behind this and will make progress on it.
But a lot of states already have Magnitsky style laws that were first introduced in the United States to enable states to prosecute and ban and take other punitive actions against people who are considered found to be abusers of human rights. They already exist, and yet I haven't seen any move by any country or even organisation to encourage any moves by any country to use the Magnitsky style laws that they already have on their books against the Taliban. And so I'm not really very optimistic, to be honest with you, about gender apartheid laws being utilised against the situation as it prevails. What do you think? Why aren't the laws that already exist being used? Why do we have to have new ones, and then after that, new ones again, and then maybe an uprising on this?
Yeah.
Maybe women have to march on the streets of London uh, Paris and wherever else to get attention to this. So the laws exist already that could be used against the Taliban, but they're not being used.
That's true, and that is the case for gender persecution. And there is a case against the Taliban that's under investigation currently with the International Criminal Court.
Mm,
Part of that investigation will include looking at evidence of violations of women's rights that fall under those laws. So there are things that can be done, and there is a lack of motivation around it.
mm,
But I think it will fall to fall to activist international lawyers, to the activists, to the diaspora community from Afghanistan, Iran, and others. We can't rely on the UN member states or even the UN itself to move this forward, but they will do so when there's enough pressure from below, and that pressure is building. So I am hopeful. But that said, the biggest thing we're missing right now is widespread public outrage about
yeah.
this, because
Mm,
at the end of the day, for all their flaws, we live in democracies here, and they do respond when it's clear that the public is worked up about a particular thing. They want to get reelected, so they will be responsive. And right now, there's very little demand for them to be responsive about this issue. And I want there to be protests on the streets of London and every capital of the world around this. And to me, it's one of the great questions of my life that I'm trying to answer is why does this
mm,
not outrage this? Like,
mm,
how can we read there was a story reported in the Guardian this summer about a women activist who was detained by the Taliban, and in prison she was gang raped, and they recorded it, and then they sent her the video threatening her, saying, if you keep speaking out against us, at this point she was in exile, we're going to release this video. So that's how she obtained the video, and she showed it to the Guardian. So they saw this really happened, and they reported the story. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it happened that this story came to light, but there's many others like her, and we know some of those women committed suicide after what happened to them. I don't know how anyone can hear about that happening and not feel outraged, that not have
mm,
their heart stirred, not want to do
mm,
something.
mm,
And certainly there are people,
mm.
we they come to us and they call us and say, I need to do something, give me a way to do it. But it's not happening at scale. And that really, really matters. Everything will kind of tip from there if the public becomes outraged about what's going on. It's something we have to grapple with, is how to help people see themselves in Afghan women and to see this as their problem too.
Yes, indeed. But getting back to the situation as it prevails, you were mentioning before efforts to provide education. There's a lot of people, I think, who are trying to and say that they are providing education for women and girls in Afghanistan, but it has to be online. And a question that always comes to my mind about that is um, how available is online education in a country where even a secure source of electricity to power up a laptop is in question, let alone the knock on the door.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the answer is more available than you think, but not available enough.
Yes. Okay.
So it is pretty incredible what women are managing to do, what they're finding themselves um, to get enrolled in. I mean, they are going to underground universities. They are going to completely virtual universities abroad. They're taking vocational courses like graphic design, because that's a vocation where you can get a remote job more easily than others. They're learning coding. Some of them are doing, more traditional professions like midwifery. There's still
Mm,
courses running in country. So there's a wide range. and they are connecting with them, but a great challenge is simply the infrastructure.
Mm.
Being able to get online, and the economic situation of the country means that fewer and fewer people can afford to pay for a home internet connection or buy a laptop. So one of our programs actually provides just that. Women can apply to us and request a data package for internet, or a laptop or a tablet or a satellite, or a power bank to get around the power shortages, so
Mm.
they can be online when they need to for their studies. Um, and we provide that, and that's something that is fairly straightforward to do. It's a practical problem that is solvable, but the demand is very, very high. We receive applications daily for this. So there's great demand, and we are seeing a real imbalance in who's accessing those programs. So the majority of applications we receive are coming from urban areas, and it's harder to reach the rural areas. Women and girls there are more isolated.
Mm.
And another thing that's happening is online secondary education. But for the most part, it's not it's informal. It's not accredited, so they're
Oh.
getting an education, but whether that's going to count at the end of the day is not always guaranteed. So that's an area that the kind of community of independent education providers is starting to look at, and some schools have figured out solutions. They've partnered up with other schools that have accreditation and are able to offer a diploma upon graduation. And that's the case for us. We're able to issue a Canadian high school diploma to
Oh.
our grade 12 graduates.
Mm.
And so I think we'll see improvements in what's sort of a chaotic scene at the moment. But the important thing is there is a lot of activity happening, and it's happening on the part of the people running these initiatives are Afghans. Some of them are exiled, some of them are in country. Many of them are women, some of them are refugees. Lots of them are partnerships between Afghans and internationals. But there's just an extraordinary amount of activity in this area, and I think that's really, really exciting. But also at this point, we sort of need to focus on things that any school system needs to pay attention to, like the quality of curriculum and
Mm.
teacher qualifications and credentialing and things like that. So this sort of parallel education system is starting to emerge. And one question is, what role will it play in the future when the political situation changes and the education system in the country reopens? How will they kind of integrate? So yeah, so it's there's a lot happening here.
Yeah, indeed, and the way you speak, and the way very many people I talk to speak, is with a sense of the inevitability of the collapse of the Taliban regime. Um, the days are numbered. It's just we don't know what the number is. But I'm curious that you did allude to the inaction of governments and the United Nations. Why do you think that is? I mean, the UN is there, paid for by people like you and I, and yet not representing what you and I want it to do. And I think the third Doha um, meeting was pretty indicative of that. We want everybody to come, including the Taliban. And the Taliban said, well, we're only going to come if nobody else comes, including women. And the UN said, okay, that
Yeah,
didn't represent me.
yeah, just so puzzling. Doha was a really shameful stamp on the UN's efforts in this area, and why it went that way, I just don't know. But I get the feeling that the UN and many of the states that participated in Doha are unreasonably trusting of the Taliban and hopeful, thinking, if we give them this, they'll give us that. And if you look at their track record, that just hasn't been the pattern at all. Going back to the 2020, when the agreement was signed between the United States and the Taliban that started negotiations. And sort of the very next day, the Taliban started violating that agreement. They violated they refused to have ceasefires, but they they just violated every tenet of that, and they were never called to account for it. And they learned from that. They learned that they can get away with it. So that's what they've been doing all along. And they do what they want and they say what they want. And I think we're failing to see the structure of the Taliban at this time, that all major decisions are made in Kandahar, by their leader, and he calls the shots. And yes, there's dissent within the Taliban. There's many members who want more engagement with the international community, who want to see girls' schools reopened, but for a variety of reasons, they don't have power in the current system, and so everyone's going along with what Akhundzada wants, and that's the way it's going to keep going. And what happened last week, the publication of these new rules that included many articles restricting women's behavior, like not being allowed to sing or speak in public, or the requirement for a full face covering. These are exactly the same rules that were in place in the 1990s when they ruled the first time. And it's, yet another example of how their goal is to revert back to that time. That's the plan. And everything they've done has shown that that's the plan. And yet the international community is still hoping that talking with them in Doha will change that. I think that there's no cost that the Taliban aren't willing to pay to have this extreme system in place. Their economy is tanking. Their people are starving. Those who aren't starving are running. They're leaving the country. It's decimating their human capital. Everything is just sort of collapsing piece by piece, and none of that matters to the Taliban leadership. They are absolutely indifferent. They're in their mansions, their palaces, happy as clams, and they will let it get much worse than this. So talking nicely with the Taliban, issuing statements of condemnation, um, it makes no difference whatsoever.
But that's
Yeah.
the same with uh, similar regimes, wherever they may be, North Korea, Hamas, Pakistan. The leaders get fat and the people starve because they don't matter. These are like mafia organizations that function and exist within their own bubble. So they don't care that the economy isn't providing jobs or food or whatever else to the people, because they just, they can let the strings out as they get fatter and fatter, of their trousers. So that isn't really a surprise to me. What is a surprise to me is that people on the ground, UN people on the ground, for instance, do seem to accept that this is what prevails. They don't seem to mind giving in. The rules that prevail in the country are the rules that we have to follow. I've had that quoted back to me from UNAMA leadership, and that's what surprises me. And these are people who've been, like you, in Afghanistan, working with Afghanistan for a very long time and know these people personally, and yet allow this situation to just get worse and worse and embedded, and pretend that there are moderates who want girls to go to school, but I believe they are moderates in name only, because they know that there are people who believe them when they say, we want girls to go to school, but he won't let us. And I think that keeps a hope of reform alive that is DOA. That's never going to happen.
Absolutely. It's a mistaken notion about what the right strategy is. That they think they're in this negotiation process, but what it actually is a slippery slope. That they're paving the way to appeasing the Taliban more and more. And it's not only the Taliban watching; it's other groups taking note that, oh, you can get away with this. They will let this happen. So I think the view is it's a pragmatic strategy to do what needs to be done. That I also hear people say, this is the only way we can get aid into this country. This is the only way we can keep people alive and help people. But there's a cost to that, and the calculation is off in terms of the short term prices we pay now. and the long-term consequences of that later on. We're not seeing the bigger picture and how this is going to further entrench the whole situation.
Yeah, and I don't believe that it's a condition of getting aid in. If it's free food, free money, yeah, open the door, go feed them, and we'll just keep doing what we do, running, global criminal cartels. That's what it is, and it's being enabled. And I really don't understand. I don't understand why. Yeah.
Yeah, as an education person, I always think about what will be written in history textbooks in the future, in 20 years, in 100 years. And I've become convinced that this time will be looked upon as really uncivilized. I mean, uncivilized in terms of what groups like the Taliban are doing to human beings, but
Mm.
uncivilized in terms of how all the outside observers responded. That we let it happen, and somehow we justified it, and we did so on the heels of very recent historical lessons that
Yeah.
should have told us. I mean, in World War II, just in last century. That you see the sort of slow buildup of fascist groups,
Mm.
and they are empowered by the silence
Yeah.
of those
And
who
the
confront
apologists. Yeah.
them. The apologists, exactly.
Mm.
And yet we're doing it all over again, and we can't recognize the players for what they are this time
Mm.
around.
Well, when you say we, I know that you don't mean you and me. We'll be on the right side of that history when it's being written, I hope. I think, I believe. um, yeah, I'm very grateful to you, Lauren, for your time, and I wish you the best of luck with the new incarnation of your organisation and with the good work that you do. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Great conversation. Thanks for having me.
That was Lauryn Oates, the head of the newly named Right to Learn Afghanistan. She talked about the impact of education bans for girls in Afghanistan, not only on the girls and women themselves, but on the entire population, socially, economically, and politically, and on the silence from the international community, governments, and organisations like the United Nations. The longer the current situation and the deafening silence around it goes on, the harder it will be to reverse the damage. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. That's all for now. I'm Lynne O'Donnell. Bye bye.